first live town hall meeting. We've had a town hall back in springtime that some of you might have participated in. I've done a couple of group town halls in Upper Bucks on the Rock Hill Quarry issue. But this is our first town hall that is just an opportunity for members of the public to come out, hear a little bit about what's happening in Harrisburg, and then for me to hear from you. And you can, let me know what your positions are, opinions are, ask questions. We're happy to have kind of a free give and take on that. I don't want it to be structured. I'm not asking you to write down questions on key cards. I'm happy to take your questions directly. That's not a problem. That's how I've always done it in the past. When I was a state representative, I'm happy to do that this way now. The one thing I would ask is if you have a cell phone with you, if you can turn that on quiet mode at this point, that would be great. The other point I would ask is if someone is asking a question and it's something you feel very strongly about, is you allow them to get their question out there by response, and then we can have further dialogue. That would be great. Just so we can be respectful of each other. I'm sure that's not going to be a problem here this evening. So what I've done in the past that I thought has worked pretty well is starting with a little bit of a summary of some of the things that are going on in Harrisburg and locally, and then I'll look forward to any questions you have. The one constraint that I really can't be talking about in a setting like this will be, political campaigns, because this is an opportunity to talk about policy. So I'm happy to talk about any issue in economic policy that impacts the state. So with that, let me start by giving you a little bit of an overview of what's been happening in Harrisburg. As you may know, I took office on New Year's Day, January 1st this year, and we got right into things shortly after that. The big issue every year in Harrisburg for the first half of the year is the budget. And the budget kind of drives the train on everything else. This year, the governor came to the legislature, as he usually does, in February, and made his budget proposal, which included an increase in education funding, K through 12, an increase in funding for early childhood education, and a few other initiatives that he had. One thing that he supported, but was not actually part of the budget and would not ordinarily be passed as part of the budget, was an increase in Pennsylvania's minimum wage as well. So we went forward in the budget process. I'm on the Appropriations Committee, which means I get to be out in Harrisburg for 3 weeks every year. There are budget hearings, and I am happy to have that responsibility because being on Appropriations gives you more insight into how the budget process works, how the state government works, and where the money is and where it's going. And it also gives you an opportunity during those hearings to question each of the secretaries of the various administrative departments who come in from the executive branch and try to explain why their departments need the money that they need. And that gives us an opportunity to talk back and forth on a number of policy issues. So we went through all that, went through the springtime, and the budget ultimately passed on time this year toward the end of June, and it did include about an extra $160 million in education funding K through 12. It did include extra money for early childhood education. It included additional money for domestic violence programs, which I think was a really good thing. It did not include more money for environmental programs, which is something that I have championed and will continue to. And on balance, it was, I would say, a good budget, not a great one, but a budget that reflected the reality of divided government, which is a Democratic governor and a Republican-controlled legislature. And I think Governor Wolf did his best to try to come up with a compromise with the Republican leadership in the House and the Senate, and that's the budget they came up with. I voted for the budget because I thought that under the circumstances, it was probably the best deal that we were going to be able to get without going through a very lengthy impasse, which has happened in the past and really does hurt our communities and our school districts in particular. Would I have liked to have seen more money on a number of different lines? Absolutely. We still rank number 47th in the country when it comes to education funding K through 12. And honestly, in my opinion, that's a disgrace. There's no other word to describe it. Pennsylvania should be doing much better than that. And it's important because greater funding for education enables schools to do so much more in terms of programming. It takes the burden off local property taxpayers, so it's more equitable in that regard. It's more progressive because property tax is paid by everybody, and at the end of the day, if you're on a fixed income, it's a much harder thing to deal with. And if the state is spending more on education, then that means that the burden of local property taxpayers does not have to increase the way it does many times every year. We also need to be putting more money into higher education, and this budget did include a bump in that number as well. But we rank number 2 in the country in student indebtedness for higher ed, and that is absolutely unacceptable in my view, because in an economy which is largely based on consumer activity, if we have young people coming out of school and getting their first job, and their first obligation is going to have to be to repay loans debt, it means that they don't have income to use toward buying things like a car, or perhaps buying a house, or other durable goods. And that has a direct impact on economic growth. So we have to do better in finding a way to lower tuitions across Pennsylvania. We have some of the highest, most expensive state schools in the country. They're great schools, but they're expensive, even when you're in state. And for those of you who have kids who've gone to Penn State or Pitt or Temple, you know what I'm talking about. So we have to do a better job in bringing those tuitions down and reducing student debt. Average debt for even a student at community college, and we have a great one here in Bucks County Community College, is about $13,000 to $15,000, which for a community college graduate is pretty high. So we need to do better in Pennsylvania on those issues. On the issue of environmental protection, we need to be doing more funding as well. One of our critical needs is on what's called HOSCA, or the Hazardous Sites Cleanup Fund. That money goes into cleaning up contaminated sites, but it also goes to, for example, buying filters for water systems that are affected by PFAS and PFOA, which we've been hearing more and more about in the news. If you're familiar with the former Naval Air Station in Willow Grove, and the firefighting foam that was used there historically, that chemical is in very high concentrations in the groundwater in that area. The fact of the matter is there's PFAS and PFOA in the environment in pretty, not as high concentrations as is the case with Willow Grove, but it's out there. And what we need to do is have a really thorough study on the impacts of that on exposure for human beings. But if we're going to address that and help clean that up and clean our water, we need to have a fund at the state level that enables municipal water authorities and towns to be able to provide that service. So it's another thing we need to be investing in the future. So that is kind of an overview of the budget. As I said, one of the governor's other priorities is something that I support, which is increasing the minimum wage. And unfortunately, that did not get done, at least so far this year. There's still a chance when we return to Harrisburg after the summer recess that can be done. But I think it's high time that we move forward with that. I'm happy to have a discussion with anyone in the legislature on either side of the aisle on that issue. There are many ways we can deal with that issue, and we should be able to find some compromise that works for everyone, but helps the lowest wage earners in our state and helps with people out of poverty. It is not an economic plan for growth. Let's make that clear, and that often gets sold that way. It is a floor to help people prevent them from falling into poverty. That's something that we should be doing. Another thing that really is a priority of mine is renewable energy and dealing with global climate change. change is real. If you don't agree and you want to have that debate tonight, I'm happy to do that. We're seeing on a regular basis with more extreme weather patterns and warmer years year after year after year that this is happening. And we are quickly getting to the point where if we don't get serious about it, there are aspects of it that are going to become irreversible. So one of the things that I got behind this spring is a piece of legislation which is known as Senate Bill 600. It is an increase in our renewable energy standards that would get us more in line with neighboring states. So true renewables, things like solar and wind, would be increased under this bill. Particularly solar, and the idea is 30 by 30, or 30% renewables by 2030. And in that, of that 30%, 1/3 or 10% of the overall picture would be solar energy. And that would break down 7.5% solar from what's called grid scale, which is large solar farms, and 2.5% solar from what's called distributed solar, which is the panels that you put on buildings or houses. It would spur growth in the solar industry here in Pennsylvania. It would lower our carbon footprint statewide. And it would obviously, in the long run, help us get to where we need to be by 2050 with respect to our targets on carbon emissions and climate change. That bill has bipartisan support. I'm happy to say that I partnered with my colleague Art Haywood, who's a fellow Democrat from Montgomery County in Philadelphia, and Tom Killian, who is a Republican from Delaware and Chester counties, to put that bill forward. There was a window where we were hopeful that we might have been able to amend that bill into a proposal to provide a subsidy for the nuclear energy industry. You might have heard that 3 Mile Island is going to be closing. Before Exelon, the owner of that, which is also the parent company for our energy provider, PECO, made the decision to close it, they were talking about trying to get a subsidy for their plants. And our thought was, well, if they're going to get some kind of subsidy, then part of that deal should be an increase in renewable energy. The subsidy piece fell away, but there is still an opportunity, I think, moving forward to do the renewable energy, particularly if, as the governor would like, Pennsylvania joins what's called the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, or MEGI, which is a number of states, mostly in the Northeast, that have come together to basically create a carbon pricing market. So that's another way that we could kind of look at this. And in terms of our portfolio of energy, and with respect to some of the nuclear plants that may not be as profitable as they used to be, if there's a carbon pricing mechanism, they would suddenly become much more profitable than they are now. So that might be something that appeals to some of these energy companies as well. We'll see whether that comes to fruition. It's something the governor has been pushing, and that hopefully will be debated when we get back in the fall. Another issue that I have been a long-time advocate for, as you may know, is gun violence prevention. As I did in Pennsylvania State House, I introduced with my colleague Vince Hughes, who is a Democrat from Philadelphia and Montgomery counties, the background check bill, once again, which would close the very narrow loophole we have in our background check system here in Pennsylvania, which pertains to the sale of so-called long guns and private sales. Those would be rifles and shotguns. Right now, if you buy one of those in a private sale, you don't have to have a background check done. Every other transaction for a firearm in Pennsylvania does require a background check. That does not. And the argument I've made many years now is we have a statute on the books right now, as most states do, that say that if you have a certain criminal history or a certain history of mental illness, you are disqualified from being able to buy a firearm. There is no way to enforce that rule unless we have a comprehensive system of background checks to make sure that person doesn't fall into one of those categories. So, again, this is a bill that has bipartisan support. Another bill on gun violence prevention issue that I proposed is a bill that would require the safe storage of firearms. so that when the firearm is not being used, it would have to be either locked in some kind of container or have a mechanism, a locking mechanism on it that would prevent it from being discharged. Where states that have adopted that type of legislation have seen dramatic decreases in deaths as a consequence of homicide, suicide, and accidents. And it's just common sense as far as I'm concerned. I know our district attorney here in Bucks County, Matt Weintraub, has been a strong proponent of getting the word out to gun owners about safe storage. That's great, but I think there's no problem that the state should be able to mandate that as well. So that's another initiative that I've been behind. On other issues, I would say reform is an important one. I am a co-sponsor of the bill to do away with the electoral college at the federal level. I think that is an anachronism and fundamentally undemocratic, and I'm happy to have a discussion about that tonight if you disagree, and we can talk about that. I believe that we do need campaign finance reform. I continue to be a proponent of that in this era of Citizens United. I can tell you that I've had personal experience with super PACs, and the amount of money that enters into our politics today is really goes beyond the pale. And it's not just the money that the campaigns and individual candidates raise, but as I said, these super PACs that come in and spend unlimited amounts of money from sources that you never know. And that really has an impact on our democracy as well. Whether you're a Democrat, Republican, Independent, Liberal, or Conservative, everyone in our country should be concerned about that. And then the last piece is gerrymandering and dealing with that issue. We need to be in a situation where voters pick elected officials, not the other way around. And I think we've seen across our country that the fundamental nature of our democracy has been subverted, not illegally, certainly not illegally under the current rules. It's been done legally, but nonetheless has caused the system to get out of whack to the point where people are really not having their voices heard. So there are a number of aspects of our democracy that I think require reform, and many of these things are on the state level, and that if that happens, I think at the end of the day we'll have more representative government. What that means in terms of policy, we'll wait and see over time. But again, regardless of where you're coming from ideologically or politically, I think it's in everyone's interest that we ensure that the majority has its say. So those are some of the things that I have been focused on locally beyond the legislative side in Harrisburg. There have been a number of issues here in the district that I've been very active in. I mentioned one before, that's the quarry up in Upper Bucks in East Rockwell, where we have a quarry that was dormant for many years that has now become active again, where they have, among other things, found asbestos in the stone, which if there is active quarrying of that and asbestos gets in the air, that's an immediate health and safety threat to the people who live around that quarry. And so I've been fighting to make sure that the Department of Environmental Protection actually does its job and holds the quarry operators to the letter of the law. So that battle is continuing on. On a related note, when it comes to environmental protection, I have long been an opponent of the proposed Elcon waste facility in the Fairless Steel site. I have written to the DEP to advocate for a denial of a hazardous waste permit for that facility. The DEP has produced a statement that they are inclined to deny the permit request, but they've given Elcon another opportunity to respond, which Elcon has now done. So we have to continue to press on that issue. The municipality, Falls Township, has denied Elcon its land use repealed that, so that's going on a separate track. So that issue is continuing on, and we'll continue to be on top of that and stand up for again what I think is the health and safety of the residents, because the facility is in an area right near the river, which, if there's a mishap, would be really devastating to the environment and to the community around it. So that's another local issue. Beyond that, we've been working with each of our municipalities. Morrisville Borough is a great town, but it's one that faces a lot of challenges, and we've been trying to help out down there through a number of grant opportunities and the like. And we continue to help here in Lower Makefield, Yardley, and a number of other areas within the 10th district. It's a big district, much bigger than the State House district that I used to represent. It starts in Falls and Tullytown in the south, and it goes all the way up to Haycock in the north. So it takes more than an hour to drive from one end to the other, and believe me, I do that pretty frequently, so I know. But it's a great district. It's very diverse. It's got a lot of great communities in it, and I'm very proud to represent it, and I'm proud to be here tonight as your state senator. So with that kind of overview, and I've taken up enough time already, let me open the floor to any questions you might have. And if you need, I don't know if we have another microphone, but just try to project as much as you can, so I want to hear your question. Yes, sir.
What's happening with the proposed expansion of the Mercer County Airport? And what are you doing with those?
Great question. So the question is, what's happening with the proposed expansion of the Mercer County Airport? So as you may know, the airport right across the river in Ewing Township has been an issue here in Lower Makefield for a number of years now. In fact, going back to when I was a township supervisor over a decade ago, I was very involved in the township, supported a lot of litigation happening at that time. We supported it financially to try to stop an expansion of the airport then. And we were successful, but now it's come back again. So I have been involved with residents, with Lower Makefield Township, with Congressman Fitzpatrick, Representative Warren, and the county as well, to try to fight the expansion of the airport. And the argument that we've been making essentially is that they are expanding in a kind of a sequenced way that is an attempt to get around the federal regulations, and not to do an environmental impact study, and not to show what the real impacts of an expanded airport would be. I don't think anyone wants to shut the airport down. That's not the point. The point is to make sure that it stays at a manageable size, and that the traffic that's going through there now does not all come over one community, namely Lower Makefield Township. So that is the battle that we're waging right now. And we are trying to put some pressure on the FAA and some of the other federal agencies to make sure that, in fact, the expansion does not happen as the airport is proposing. But we're not getting a lot of cooperation on the New Jersey side, I have to tell you. Congresswoman Watson Coleman's office has been uncommunicative at best, and the freeholders and the county government in Mercer has just been completely unhelpful. So this has been a lift mostly by elected officials on this side of the river, residents and resident groups like Graham, and some residents on the New Jersey side as well. And so we're going to continue to do that battle. Yes?
How about voting machines and making sure our elections are fair? And I think we would perceive as fair. I mean, it's not just the fact that we know that it's fair, it's that people don't have the perception that their vote is actually being counted is also important.
Right.
So I know we're waiting for federal money for that too, so how does that all tie in?
Well, we
Steve, you're
I'm sorry. So the question is about the voting machines. As you may know, the governor has made a decision that we should be changing our voting machines by the 2020 election. And a couple of counties have done that already. Other counties like Bucks are still looking at different voting machine alternatives to do that. The governor has proposed a bond issue that would help counties pay for that. But I believe it's critical that we do it. critical that we have voting machines that have a paper ballot that would provide some kind of record of how someone intended to vote. The machines we have right now don't do that. You go in, you press a button, and the only record is, what is on the cartridge of the machine at the end of the night, which, if the machine goes down or there's some kind of electronic problem, is going to be worthless, or at least, you're not going to have a backup record to be able to tell, okay, what was the actual count. So, many states have gone to systems where they have a paper ballot that's scanned into a machine that then tallies the vote. Montgomery County just purchased that type of system recently. They used it at the election this past spring. That is, I think, the optimal approach, because that gives you the ability to maintain a paper record of your vote, at the same time have the votes tallied quickly and electronically, so those can be tabulated at the end of the night. We have to be concerned. We have to be concerned at the end of the day about potential hacking, to the extent that some of these systems are ever connected in any way to the internet. But not just that. When the machines are being prepped and stored prior to an election, that we're sure there's security to maintain that no one has access to them, and they could potentially try to do something to them at that point. So anyhow, in Bucks, that process is moving forward, and it's moving forward throughout the state.
Please respond to your response, please.
Sure, yeah.
The problem, if you pay any attention to the district attorney race in Queens County in New York, they have paper ballots, they have a problem. People mark them wrong. They vote for one people, they vote for nobody. There's misleading marks on there. The last election in New York City, high humidity, the scanners showed reading the ballots. I would like something between the electronic thing that we have now, where there's no record, and paper ballots, which I think are totally antiquated. There has to be something else in this.
Well, maybe there is, and what I would suggest is that you contact the county commissioners, because they're the ones that ultimately need to make that decision here in Bucks County. I don't think there's any system that's foolproof. What you're talking about in terms of overvoting, that happens.
Or undervoted.
Or undervoting. Well, yes, but overvoting is more of a problem, because the whole ballot, everything on that, for that vote has to be thrown away. And we saw that back in 2000 in Florida. That's an issue, but I think a bigger threat is the potential that the votes get lost altogether. And I can tell you, as a candidate who has waited after 8 o'clock on election night for the returns, and I hear, well, there are 3 machines down in, the North Precinct of Upper Makefield, or wherever it might be, you get a knot in your stomach, because you don't know what that means. Are they going to be able to access the data on that cartridge or not? And the machines we have here in Bucks County, they were used when they bought them. They were old when they bought them 11 years ago now. So 12 years ago now. So I do think that as the technology improves, some of the issues you mentioned will start to be resolved. But if you've researched the issue and you know that there are better alternatives or a better approach, I would just suggest talk to the county commission, make your voice heard. I think they've had a couple of open houses where they've had different machines available for voters to come in and take a look at. So by all means, reach out to them. Yes, ma'am.
We're of course thrilled to hear that you support the effort to end political gerrymandering. We had at least over 3,000 of your constituents have signed a petition that's on record. Many have written to you or contacted you to indicate that, yes, we need redistricting repeal. Right now, there are a couple of House bills going through the House, which are addressing this in an appropriate manner. What's going through the Senate is not, because it's still a legislative-based source. We'd like to know if you're looking at finding a way to introduce something in the Senate that it mirrors the House bills, or if you can get cozy with people in the state government committee to avoid the disaster that happened with the last set of bills that were basically torpedoed. And we can't really wait and see unless we're willing to wait and see a decade, because the census is on us. Redistricting is on us. So we'd be interested to hear what you plan to do about it.
So I think we missed it for the next round, honestly. I mean, I know there's a plan to look at, I think it's the congressional, redistricting only, as opposed to the state legislative redistricting. The opportunity that we had, the initial bill that Fair Districts proposed was something I supported. When it was amended, I didn't support it, because the amendment introduced this legislative oversight, might not be the right word, but legislative opportunity to impact the process. And the problem with that is it's what I call faux reform. It's not real reform. It makes everyone think that we've reformed the gerrymandering process, but in fact, what it would have done, is kept the legislative finger in the pie, and that would have been a huge mistake. So now we're here in 2019, and the problem is for a constitutional amendment to have to pass something in 2 consecutive sessions and then bring it to the ballot for the voters to vote on. The census gets done in 2021, and the redistricting happens that year. While I support trying to get something done, I think it's unlikely that that's going to happen with the current majorities in both the House and the Senate, because these are the same people who really just wanted to keep some kind of legislative control over the process. I think we need more change in the legislature, frankly, to make it a reality. And from my perspective, whenever that happens, if it happens after the 2020 election and we can get a majority of folks to make the change, regardless of when it's ultimately effective, we need to make the change. Now, in 2021, if nothing happens and the system continues the way it is, so that for congressional redistricting, it's a piece of legislation that the legislature passes and it goes to the governor. With Governor Wolf, there's a check on that process, because assuming that there are still Republican majorities in the House and the Senate, and that's an assumption, because that might not be the case, you would have a Democratic governor, and so there would have to be some kind of compromise. And there's an opportunity there for citizens to weigh in to make sure that whatever map comes out of that process is fair. And I think you've seen with the Supreme Court that they are amenable to challenges where there is gerrymandering done. I mean, they threw out that last map. Let me tell you, that congressional map was egregious, as I'm sure you would agree. It was hard. There were people who with a straight face claimed it was not gerrymandered. I voted against that map when it came in front of us in 2011. Had there been a Democratic map as egregious as that, I would have voted against it too. It wasn't just there was a Republican map that would happen to be, because there were Republican majorities at that point and a Republican governor. Gerrymandering is pernicious no matter who's doing it. When the Supreme Court threw that map out and drew their own map, it was pretty clear that it's not hard to do to draw what are, in essence, fair maps. And I think just about any high school kid with a computer these days would know how to do that in a way that's fair. What did that produce overnight? We have 18 members of the U.S. House of Representatives in Pennsylvania. That's our current allotment. We had 13 Republicans and 5 Democrats, despite the fact that there are 600,000 more Democrats statewide, and despite the fact that in each of these congressional elections, if you tally up all the votes for Democrats and all the votes for Republicans, there were more votes for Democrats. But there were still 13 Republicans and 5 Democrats. Now, it was gerrymandered. The Supreme Court threw that map out. They mandated their own fair map, and you end up with 9 Republicans and 9 Democrats. So it can be done. And so my point is, that even if there is not a reform passed by the legislature before the next redistricting round, there is still the opportunity to challenge, and I think a Supreme Court that would be willing to throw it out. I'm not telling you, I'm not disagreeing with you, I'm trying to tell you the reality of the politics in Harrisburg right now, which is the problem. So I'm trying to look at ways that we can still effectuate a fair map at the end of the day. I happen to think Pennsylvania might lose a congressional seat in the next census. And if that happens, there's going to have to be a redistricting. But I think it's going to be very hard for either party to argue that the current map needs to be changed in significant ways other than losing that one seat. So I think we as citizens are still going to have a pretty powerful position to challenge something that is egregious. And that's something that I think we have to do. Now, on the state redistricting side, when it comes to that process, that's a different process. That doesn't get passed as legislation. There is a redistricting commission which is comprised of the Democratic and Republican leaders in the House, the Democratic and Republican leaders in the Senate, and then a fifth person that they're supposed to agree on. Now, shockingly, they are never able to agree on that fifth person. So the law provides that the state Supreme Court chooses that fifth person. In 2011, the Supreme Court chose a former Republican judge from Delaware County who basically rubber stamped what turned out to be a very gerrymandered partisan map of the House and the state Senate. This time around, there's a Democratic Supreme Court, so who knows who that fifth person is going to be. But either way, the process needs to be a fair one. The current maps, both in the Senate and the House, are very gerrymandered. Again, that has enabled, a majorities in both houses, which probably are not warranted based on the voting history of the state and the registration in the state. I'm not arguing for Democratic maps. I'm not arguing for Republican maps. I'm arguing for fair maps. And again, that map, by the way, you may recall, was challenged. The first state legislative map was challenged in the state Supreme Court back in 2011. It was thrown out, and a second map was adopted. The problem is the second map was very similar to the first map, so there wasn't much of a difference. There's a new Supreme Court now, and this Supreme Court doesn't seem to be inclined to put up with nonsense. So again, if we're not able to get these reform measures passed, I'm in favor of, doing everything we can, working together to challenge anything that comes out of this process that's unfair. And you have my word on that. So.
You'll remember that.
You should. It's on tape.
The governor's with you.
Yes. Absolutely. Yeah. Yes, sir.
I just want to speak in opposition to your opposition to the Electoral College.
Okay.
That flag has 50 stars on it. Doesn't have one big star. It represents 50 sovereign states, government borders, natural resources, cultures, climates, and employment abilities. And it's 50 states, and they all entered the Constitution by vote. And it started, of course, with 13 colonies.
Right.
And there's certain provisions that make each state have, if not an equal place, a fair place, just like you're talking about. You have 2 senators and then subvert the will of your citizens. I mean, you can change electoral college a lot different ways. You can go out there and do proportional. We'll give this much to this activity, this much to put in proportion. But states won't do that. California won't do that. Pennsylvania won't do it because we love that thing 20. So what I'm saying is that system's in place for a reason. And I feel as though you've taken the oath of office to represent your people, your state, and you should not be in any way subverting the will of the citizens.
Well, thank you. So, did everyone hear that? Okay. So I fundamentally disagree. I think you have 50 stars, you have 50 states, e pluribus unum, out of many one. We are still one country. We fought a civil war over the issue of states' rights versus the federal government. No one is talking about taking sovereignty away from the states as they exist in our federal system. Let me finish. Okay, that's fine. And I'll call on you. You can sit anytime. All we're talking about is doing away with an antiquated system that was fundamentally undemocratic when it was passed. And I disagree with the founding fathers on this. They thought that this was an opportunity to, well, frankly, they were worried about, having the populist control, having that level of control. They wanted some check on that, and they thought that was necessary. Partly because they were worried about, some dictator coming to power. They thought that if there was enough popular support behind someone, they were concerned about that. So they thought that this electoral college was a check on that. I think that is fundamentally paternalistic and undemocratic. At the end of the day, if a majority of Americans think that Joe Smith should be president of the United States and they so vote, Joe Smith should be president of the United States. Not because the system dictates that, the other candidate got more electoral votes. The fact that we have a large population that lives on the coast and a large population that live in the East Coast and West Coast doesn't mean that the people in the middle of the country would be disenfranchised. They still have a vote. They do. Their vote would still be counted. And the total votes of 60 some odd million on one side and 60 some odd million on the other would be every individual American, no matter where they live. In the continental United States, in Alaska, and Hawaii, and their votes would be counted. So I don't understand, frankly, why that's a bad idea, because at the end of the day, that gives everyone an equal voice. And the way it works right now is that the people in those little states that you're talking about, and we can have a separate discussion about equal representation in the Senate, okay, and why that was done. And that was important to try to balance the rights of the states, and I get that. But there is no justification for saying that someone who lives in Idaho should have proportionally a greater say in the presidential election than someone who lives here in Pennsylvania, or someone who lives in Texas, or someone who lives in California. There is no, I'm sorry, I just don't think there's any rationale in this day and age to allow that to happen. Now listen, we've had, in the last 2 decades, 2 presidents who were elected without even a plurality of the vote. And I would argue that those elections and the outcomes of those elections were pretty consequential for the United States. Now, they were legitimately elected. I'm not contesting that. But I think that those 2 elections point out that this system, the time for this system has passed, if it ever was. And it's time that we do away with this system and we allow every American's vote to be counted equally, and it doesn't disenfranchise anybody. It really doesn't.
Is this a dialogue or is this a public meeting?
Well, Zach, let John.
was the Senate. Now, at the same time the Constitution was written, they said every slave counted as 3/5 of a person for population. Not as a person, but for population. So if you know the history of the Electoral College, it was the southern states got disproportionate representation of the Electoral College to get presidents elected. Except for the two Adams, they were all southern, from the all southern states, because the Electoral College, besides being elitist, taking away the popular vote from the populace, was a given vote to the slave states. So let's learn our American history now in the 21st century.
Okay. I think we've talked this issue through. Thank you. Yes, Bill.
History teacher who loves this conversation. I'd like to change the subject.
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead.
Okay, this morning in the Inquirer, there was an article about the changes for requirement for the dry town
Yes.
stuff. Can you talk about that?
Yes. So the question is about the dry town status. How many here are Lower Makefield Township residents, just by a show of hands?
Say
Okay.
it again, please.
It's about the dry town status in Lower Makefield.
I was
I'm gonna explain. So, I'm sure most of you know this, but there's some who don't know this. Lower Makefield is a dry town, which means you can't, other than a golf course, buy alcohol for consumption. It is the only dry town in Bucks County. It's the only dry town in Bucks and Montgomery counties, which are the only 2 A-class counties in Pennsylvania. So, right now, up until now, there has been a requirement that if you want to undo a dry town status, which was done by a referendum, in our case back in, I think, 1946, you have to do another referendum to get people to overturn it. To get that question on the ballot, you have to get a percentage of the votes at the last election, which turns out in most cases to be a very high number, something like 3,000 to 5,000 signatures on a petition, and you have only a 3-week period in which to do that. It's very hard to do in a single community. So I amended the liquor code back in June to require no more than 500 signatures on a petition to get that question on the ballot. So that change becomes effective sometime in September, and starting probably next spring, if citizens decide they want to put that issue on the ballot by getting 500 signatures, it will be able to be on the ballot in the April election. And then every resident of Lower Makefield is registered to vote, independent, Democrat, or Republican, to go to the polls and make their voices heard on whether or not they want the town to remain a dry town. I have my own views on that, but the whole purpose of the change was to give citizens the right to be able to make that decision. The bar that existed up until now was so tough that it was never going to get on the ballot for a question. So stay tuned. That will likely, very likely be on the ballot in the not too distant future.
Steve,
Yeah.
we have a couple of questions from Facebook.
Sure.
If I could offer. One is there an update on ending puppy mills and animal cruelty?
So regrettably, we are not closer to doing that right now, although there is growing support in the legislature on both sides of the aisle to address those issues. And in fact, a number of us have signed on to legislation to limit breeding that a lot of these puppy mills do, and what that does to these dogs, which is really a horrible thing. And those of us who are dog owners and love animals, we're fighting for that. So I think that we're moving in the right direction, and that there is growing support on both sides of the aisle to make that a reality.
Another one from Facebook from Mary. When will Pennsylvania pass a law restricting the use of handheld cell phones while driving?
It's a great question. So when I was in the State House, we outlawed texting while driving, but not the use of a handheld phone while you're driving. Now, as a practical matter, many of the cars these days have Bluetooth technology, and so I hope most of us are using that on a daily basis. But there are still some folks who don't do that, and so I do think that we need to make that change. We tried to get both of those things done about 8 years ago when the texting ban went into place, but there was opposition on the handheld cell phone use, which I still don't frankly understand. There are still a lot of people who text, by the way, and that is a serious problem. And if I can give a little, a public announcement here, because many times I see, when I'm at a stoplight, people are pulling up and they're looking down at their phone, or they're coming at you in the opposite direction and they're looking down at their phone. There, but for the grace of God, we don't have a serious problem on our hands. So, even though we have banned texting while driving in Pennsylvania, it's not always being followed by people, and we need to continue to work on public awareness of that issue and the fact that all of us just put the phone in the glove box, put it away, don't look at it, don't be tempted to look at it. Whatever it is, it can wait until you get to where you're going. And I have to say, for those of us who grew up and still remember a time when we weren't so connected, when you still had to call people on a landline. I always say that my kids never had to deal with the terror of calling a girlfriend or a boyfriend and having to deal with the parent who picked up the phone. They get to simply text and don't have to deal, skip that. I think that's going to have an impact on their psyche somehow. I think we'll see in like 20 years what the population is like as a consequence of that. But we can make that a little bit. But this, we are, I think, in many ways over-connected these days. And there's a lot of great, the technology has created a lot of great things. But I think one of the downsides is that we tend to get a little too connected sometimes. And when you're in the car, it's not the time. It's better just to put it away. Yes?
Speaking of being in the car, can you give us an update on the Scudder Falls Bridge, especially the rerouting of traffic that's going to come through Yardley very soon?
Yes. So the question is the Scudder Falls Bridge and the rerouting of traffic in Yardley. So let me just back up a little bit of the history. The Scudder Falls Bridge, the old bridge, was built back in the late 50s, early 60s. It has had to be replaced now for a number of years. In fact, the Bridge Commission, which owns the bridge, first came to us in Lower Makefield. My first year as a township supervisor was 2004, so that was 15 years ago. And they were supposed to have the new bridges built by sometime at the end of that decade. That was 10 years ago. A lot of things happened in the meantime, the Great Recession, among others, which made it hard for them to float bonds. So we are today where we are. So the first span has been completed. The second span is being decommissioned, and the new span is being built next to that. So ultimately, there will be 2 new spans with 3 lanes of traffic going in each direction and acceleration and deceleration lanes, which will make it much safer and accommodate a lot more traffic to make it go much faster, so you won't be sitting in traffic all the time. Route 295, which by the way, they should have called it something like 895, because it's so ridiculously confusing. And I've spoken to our transportation secretary here in Pennsylvania, Leslie Richards, about it. I don't understand how, 295 south is going north. It's so, for those of us who live around here, it's the most confusing, and they could have made it easy by just making it like 895 from the turnpike, Pennsylvania Turnpike out to Route 1, and that would have solved the problem, but that's too easy. So we'll still work and see whether we get something on that. In the meantime, as they're making these changes, they have to change the flow of traffic onto the bridge on both sides of the river. And they've also instituted tolling, which you may be aware of. And that's one of the reasons why I have reintroduced a piece of legislation that I had when I was in the State House that I introduced back when we first decided to toll the new bridge in 2012, I think it was. That would be a tax credit for commuters up to $500 a year, or half of your toll burden up to $500 a year. And Perry Warren, State House has introduced that bill in the House as well. So we're going to continue to push for that. So that is now being told, coming back in the southerly or northerly, or whatever direction you want to call it, but into Pennsylvania. So now we have the issue of where the traffic is going to be rerouted, and they are working on that over the coming month or so in getting that all through. In terms of the details of that, I don't know if some of my staff have more details. But Dan, do you have a little bit of that?
Yeah, it's going to be for, if I believe I know what you're speaking about, it's going to be for about 3 weeks. You are going to come through the borough, which will probably slow you down quite a bit for at least those 3 weeks. Now it's the summertime, so traffic's already kind of just in school, you're on vacation, so it's difficult to determine how that's going to be backed up, but I would definitely give yourself some extra time. They're also going to be closing for about 3 weeks on the Jersey side as well. So it is going to be a bit of an issue over the next, especially month or so. You always have a plan that's going to take longer. But if you have any more detailed questions right now, you can see us after. We can kind of walk you through and show you the map.
Yeah, and part of the problem is that it's just a big job to redo all these, basically a clover leaf on both sides. My recommendation, go over Route 1.
Yeah, I just want to have a quick follow-up. We
Yeah.
have a big event with Girl Scouts coming up. It's going to be right down in Yardley, and we contacted Chief Kelly about it, and
Okay.
he did not know that the rerouting was going to be happening in Yardley. So it's just more of a communication. A piece of advice I have is that maybe we can do a little bit better at communicating with the local law enforcement so they know what's coming in, because we want to keep our kids safe on the roads.
Sure, yeah. And when's that event?
Next week.
Next week, okay.
And
Yeah.
I spoke to the chief the other day, so we can
We- And we will talk to the Bridge Commission to remind them of that too. The Bridge Commission is an entity that's created by both Pennsylvania and New Jersey. And the governors of each state appoint the members of the commission, so it's a little hard sometimes. It's another layer of an entity that we have to deal with. I mean, they've been pretty responsive generally, so we'll just make sure that they do that.
They just gave a presentation at the LMT Board of Supervisors.
Okay.
So they had a gentleman, Joe Donnelly, maybe he could give your presentation.
Well, that I assume was taped, right?
Yes.
That presentation?
Oh, yes.
So if you go on to the Lower Makefield Township website, they will have that segment of the meeting you can get to pretty easily and see that presentation. Dan?
Yeah, sorry, I'm Lower Makefield Township. Also, Scudder Falls Bridge, let me see, ScudderFallsBridge.com. There's a nice video that they put up on YouTube as well that shows what's going on over the next few weeks, but also feel free to check out our meeting. They gave a nice presentation.
Great. Yes?
When kids are in college, they vote with absentee ballots, and it can be a hassle for them to follow through with all the steps. Is there anything being done to make that easier?
Not that I'm aware of at the moment, although what should happen is you should be able to apply for that online as opposed to downloading the application, filling it out, and sending it in. It's an extra step that a lot of college kids, it's another impediment to getting the process. I'm in favor of no-fault early voting, voting by mail. A lot of these things that have been done in other states with no problem have increased the amount of participation in our elections. And I think we need to be doing that in Pennsylvania too. But that's a reform that I think the state should be looking at. Right now, I think they're really mostly focused on the voting machine issue, but they got to chew gum and walk at the same time. I think that's something else they should be doing as well. So I will take that back to them too. Yes, sir.
I'd just like to bring up some mundane issues, two in particular.
Yep.
The liability of electric power grid and anti-consumer laws in Pennsylvania. I live in Falls Township, running the border of Lower Mayfield, near the intersection of Big Oak and Mayfield Road. 23 days I've lost power 3 times as 3 storms came through. And obviously you believe in climate change, we're getting more storms, more powerful. And PICO, they trim trees, that's not enough. This is something that needs to be addressed on a statewide level, that whether it's 10 feet, 20 feet around power lines, all the trees gotta go. I mean, because otherwise it's just the same circle, we're stuck in the circle, the trees come down, another storm, more trees come down, and locally, Falls supervisors, Lower Makefield supervisors, they can't do anything about it. And I don't really want to blame PICO because they're just doing what they're used to doing, but
So this is an issue that I've been involved with for a number of years now. It used to be much worse than it is now, believe it or not. And one of the things we had them do a number of years ago, I went down to Philadelphia and I met with the CEO of PICO, and we convinced them to be much more aggressive on the tree trimming. But as you say, that's only part of it. The other piece of it is upgrading their infrastructure, their power lines, and the other systems that feed our electric grid. They have begun to do that, and in many places where we had very unreliable service before, it's improved. Now, it is true in the last couple of months, we've had a number of significant events that have caused outages for a day or two. We used to have much more severe impacts than we are, but I think we should assume that we're going to continue to have these weather events. The problem here is actually more unique than you think, because PICO has a pretty antiquated electric grid compared to some of the other providers. And this may have something to do with the rural nature of this area up until relatively recent times. Many of the lines are very long lines and high voltage lines. They tend to be much more susceptible to being disrupted when they are hit, even by a small wind. And instead of having kind of nodes where there are lines that go out from those nodes and connect people, they have much longer connections that go across, and those tend to be much more susceptible to these types of events. So I think for us, and that is not necessarily the case in other parts of the state, I think it's much more of a localized issue for us here in the PICO service area. And what we need to do now, and we will follow up with them as we move forward, is make sure that PICO's got a plan moving forward to how they're going to start to change that design, because it's a major problem. And it's not just about what would be a very costly proposition of burying the lines, because obviously that would be the best solution. But that is a very costly one. There are things they can be doing now to break up these long lines that would help increase reliability. And so that's something we'll be working on.
The other issue is, I brought this up with other state senators and state reps, and it just goes nowhere. Pennsylvania has a number of anti-consumer laws, and I'm just going to talk about three of them. There's way more. First is the inheritance tax. Pennsylvania is one of only 6 states that have an inheritance tax. People work their whole life paying income tax, sales tax, property tax. Then they die, they leave their money with somebody, and they have to pay an inheritance tax on 4.5% to 15%. There's an antiquated law, needs to be gotten rid of. Brings in very minimal revenue for the state. Okay? Second one, something most people have never heard of, the milk marketing report. They not only set the price for milk at the farm, but they set minimum retail prices for milk. Not maximum prices for milk, but retail at every store. In New Jersey today, half gallon of milk, $1.64. Here in Pennsylvania, $2.29. 65 cents a half gallon, $1.30 a gallon. Whose pocket does $1.30 a gallon go in? Doesn't go into consumers' pockets. And I'll point out that the people who need the calcium the most, women and children that hurt the most like this. Antiquated, need to get rid of it. And then the third thing is, people buy houses. They're not aware there's minimum prices set for title insurance by state law. There's no other insurance, car insurance, homeowners insurance, health insurance, any other insurance where there's a minimum price set by state law. Again, an antiquated law that needs to be gotten rid of. Well, thank you very much for listening.
Thank you. Absolutely. And we're taking all that down. We'll take a look at those things. Yes, Bill.
Thank you for calling me. But I just wanted to ask a question about PICO and the electric lines. I used to have a house up in Poconos, and years ago, PP&L, that was the provider up there. They had a 10-foot easement on either side of the lines and above. I remember getting a notice from here that they were going to come in and take their easement, clear everything out. It followed a really bad ice storm that we had out there in the late 90s. And they came in and took it out. Is it possible that PP&L has that and PICO doesn't? And if PICO does have it, why aren't they doing it?
Yeah, so it's more of an issue historically of keeping on top of the trimming. But again, that's only part of the problem. It's the design of the grid as well, and updating some of the equipment too. And when they did that in some of the areas of Lower Mayfield about 6 years ago, it made a dramatic difference in terms of the reliability. So, but we still have a ways to go. Other questions? Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Senator, we'd like to circle back to the college tuition costs. In New Jersey last year, they started a pilot program in 12 colleges where if your income level was below a certain amount, like $40,000, the kids could go to school for free. Would Pennsylvania consider looking into that and seeing how that's doing over in New Jersey and possibly replicate that?
Absolutely. I mean, I think we should look at that. I think we should look at what some of the other states, and this is, again, part of the what's great about our federal system, that the states all have different approaches to some of these things. Some of them work, some of them don't. But we can learn from what those other states are doing. So, and, you know, we should be looking at that program and seeing, again, because for me, that's a real critical issue. We have to make higher education accessible, and if it's too costly, it's not accessible. Thanks. We'll take a look at that. Yes?
I don't know if this is a federal issue or state issue, but just like the whole high cost of prescription medications, it's just really out of hand. I had a prescription that on my old insurance was like $1,400 a month, and I would have to get it from Canada and pay $353 and get it mailed from Canada. I now have fortunately better insurance, but my prescription was it's past the patent. They sold what do you call it? It wasn't generic yet. They sold the patent. They sued for patent protection rights. So I'm just saying, is there going to be like more laws against setting a max about how much prescriptions can be for certain medications?
I think that there will likely be changes at the federal level after the next election, is my guess. And I think that includes not just changes to the Affordable Care Act in terms of insurance coverage, but also with respect to prescription drug costs. We have a serious problem in this country right now with the cost of healthcare, right? And the cost of insurance that is still very expensive for what it covers, and that expensive either in the form of high premiums or high deductibles, and very high prescription drug costs. And nobody should be put in that situation. Nobody should be put in a situation where they're deciding between prescription drugs that they need and buying food on a weekly basis or any other basic needs that people have. So we have to do better. I think that is likely to come at the federal level. To be candid, I think it's something that needs to come at the federal level because it needs to, the entire country needs to be in a space where we have a more affordable system where people are getting the care that they need. But thank you. Yes.
Just a community awareness. In our daily police law, every day, Kohl's and ShopRite.
Right.
Some get caught, some don't.
Right.
I love Wegmans, but this is gonna bring in, and they're buying the big super highways, they're just driving along. Is there gonna be, more security? I know the police can't be everywhere every minute,
Right.
but is there going to be an expansion with the police department or a different security? I mean, every day the stores are being robbed. And my other awareness is I am finding more and more abandoned homes, single residential homes. No for sale sign, they just sit there empty. Sometimes they don't have anybody mow the lawns, which is a high sewer.
Right. Right.
What is happening?
Well, those are mostly local issues. And I don't want to, our township supervisors are more than happy if you go to a Lower Mayfield Township meeting to bring some of those questions up. I can tell you that Chief Coluzzi, who's who's our chief of police here in Norfolk, does an excellent job, and his police department does an excellent job. I'm sure he would tell you that they could always use more officers, but it's expensive, and the township has to try to balance the cost and providing the security that is their number one obligation to the residents of the town. So that's something that, I think we need to explore the township in terms of that. With respect to homes that may be vacant, I don't know whether it's happening in particular areas that you noticed, or is it just
Well, there's the one around Thorn on Edgewood Road.
on Edgewood Road?
There's one up by Giant in the corner, everybody has to go around and take a look to see if the cars are coming.
That in Edgewood Village, that has, yes, there are lots of issues there, and it's a historic structure, and that's part of the issue. Getting back to the liquor referendum, if that passes, there's likely to be more development in that area that will start to kind of change something after that, I think. So,
I have one question.
Yeah.
This is downtown Yardley. All the heavy trucks that come to that area, by the Wawa,
Right.
larger and larger trucks. I don't know if it's because of GPS telling us a shortcut, but we don't see the sign that they're not allowed to come until you get right to town. If there's signs closer to where they come over the highway, so they know that's kind of.
yeah, they are allowed to go through Main Street, but the turn is where they're restricted in terms of weight.
In order when you put their mirrors, because they'll take the mirrors off your door.
Yeah, the problem is they're trying to avoid the way station, I don't know if the way station is functioning at the moment, the way station on the interstate. This has been a problem for years. Laura Mayfield, when I was in the Board of Supervisors, I was a state rep, now as a state senator. The problem has been getting PennDOT to disallow the trucks on the road. They won't do that. So I think really what we need to look at are other traffic calming things that might make it less enticing for the trucks to take that route and avoid the highway. So that's something we need to revisit, I think, because it's a problem. I know it really is disruptive to the borough, and and I live here, so yeah, absolutely. Thanks. Other questions? Yes, sir.
I'm a big proponent of armed self-defense. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I'm a big proponent of armed self-defense. 90% of the time when I'm out in public, I'm carrying a gun, taking various classes, including the Boston County Sheriff's action shooting class. And one of the things he mentioned in that class was that within 10 minutes of the active shooter beginning of the attack, it takes 10 minutes for police to arrive on the scene. And that's when most of the deaths take place. Now, I know I say all of our position on guns, but I know you're against teachers having the option of taking training, taking the same training that security guards take, armed security guards take, and doing the annual qualification. Why do you think that's better than not having the option? No one's forcing them to take it. They want to take that training, meet the qualification annually, and be armed to protect themselves and their kids in their class. Why shouldn't they have an option?
Okay, so the question is, why do I oppose having teachers armed in schools, even teachers who are trained? So we'll accept that definition of it. So a couple of things. Let me back up. Gun violence is an issue that has a lot of causes, right? One of them is the issue that I raised before, which is doing what we can to make sure people who should not have access to firearms don't get access to firearms. Another is access to firearms like AR-15s that are capable of discharging many rounds in a very short period of time, as we've seen in a lot of these situations where there have been mass casualties. Another is mental illness. And being able to identify it early and treat someone who has a problem before that person acts in an irrational way that results in one of these tragedies. When you look at schools, I think the best way to protect our kids and keep them in an environment where it focuses on learning and growing as opposed to being worried about, these horrible incidents of gun violence, is first to make sure that there's adequate security in the school, that someone can't break in and get inside who shouldn't be there. That's point number one. Secondly, to make sure we have adequate resources within the schools to identify kids who are there who might have issues, right? We're not doing enough right now to fund mental health professionals in our schools, to fund counselors in our schools, and to provide that support network that, frankly, teachers and administrators need to help identify those kids who are most at risk and get them the help that they need. And that's not just, by the way, a kid who presents a potential risk of committing one of these horrific acts, as it is as much preventing a kid that might be inclined or be at risk for suicide, for example. So that's really important. I think that's how we make safer schools. I just fundamentally disagree with the notion that introducing more guns into schools is something to help make them safer. I don't care how well trained a teacher might be. I think it's a much different situation when we're in that active shooter situation. And God forbid, if you have more people with guns in those situations, I think there's a greater chance that someone is going to get killed. And I just think that's a bad idea and not what we should be doing in Pennsylvania. I'll let you respond. I think instead we should focus on these other things that I'm talking about. I was a teacher. I've been in schools. I was a teacher in a situation where we had a lockdown because there was a robbery across the street from the school, and there was a person with a gun who could have very easily got into the school. So I've been in that situation in a dark room with 30 kids in the corner, and the door locked and the light out for an hour and a half, not knowing what was going on. Right? I know how terrifying that can be. And no kid in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania should be put in a situation where they should have to worry about their own safety in a school building. But I think we should be focusing on those other things that I'm talking about that cost money and require an investment, but can make a real difference in making our schools safer places for our kids to go. And as a parent, I'm much more comfortable with that than knowing that some of my former colleagues are walking around with guns. I love them. I really do. They're great people, and they went into education for the right reason. We got one former teacher and one current teacher right here. I don't want to see either one of them with a gun in the school. I love them to death, but no, I don't want to see that. But seriously, I fundamentally disagree. I just don't think adding more guns into that environment is the way to go. But you have a response, so go ahead.
Yeah, so I just want to say a couple things. First, that we as individuals are not entitled to police protection. You may not know that. The Supreme Court has determined you are responsible for your own protection. If you don't keep things, you look it up yourself. The Shaney versus Winnebago County and Castle Rock versus Gonzalez. You can look it yourself. You're not entitled to police protection, even if you have a restraining order against an attacker and they threaten you and they attack you and kill you. Your family, you're dead, and your family can't sue the government for protection. So
think, again, getting back, and I don't want to go back and forth on this, but getting back to the issue of guns in the schools, there are so many different circumstances that can arise. And then having those guns in that environment just, I think, increases the likelihood that something bad can happen. And I would much prefer to have greater security for access to the schools and better support within the schools and rely on our local law enforcement. Then we're going to end it there. Yes, ma'am.
I just wanted to respond to Doug. I work with people that have television. I know, and I believe that people should be able to carry a gun if they want, but I do not believe it belongs to school. And this is the reason why. Children, when they go into the schools, need to feel safe. And Monday, do you feel safe to carry a gun? When a little girl or a little boy is sitting in a classroom and the teacher has a gun, just feels intimidated. So just take it from their perspective. I believe we need to protect our children, but I don't believe that that's going to help them in the long run because they're going to be intimidated. If you guys were all standing up there with guns, it would intimidate me. I wouldn't feel comfortable.
Feeling safe and being safe is two different things. And you're not going to be flashing a gun in front of children. You're going to have a lot.
All right, well, why don't we do this? We can continue that conversation later, but thank you for the thoughts on that. We're getting late, so I want to open just one more question if someone has a question they'd like to raise.
It's a different question. I was recently up at with veteran came in a community college.
Yes.
About legalization.
Yeah.
I'm a former teacher. You're a former teacher, and for those reasons, especially because of the high caliber stuff that's coming out of Colorado, I just want to know your impression of that being West County, unruly, but what was your general impression of how, and what is your opinion?
Well, so I'm not in favor of legalizing marijuana. I think we have to see more how it plays out in some of these other states. I think there are a lot of issues that have arisen that have not been satisfactorily answered, in my view. And again, back to this great about the federal system, we're able to see how that plays out. I also think this is not the most pressing issue facing Commonwealth of Pennsylvania right now. As I said that night, I voted for the use of medical marijuana because I was convinced by a lot of people who came in and told me their personal stories that this was going to be helpful to treating their pain. I believe that's been the case. I also concluded is to manufacture and sell opioids allegedly for pain treatment. We should give people access to cannabis for that purpose. I think we have many more issues, pressing issues facing the state. I know the Lieutenant Governor decided that this was the issue. He wanted to do a 67 county listening tour, and he came to Bucks County, and he's the Lieutenant Governor, and I'm a state senator. Out of respect, I went to listen to the listening tour, and it was interesting to hear some of the views of different people. It didn't persuade me that, I should change my position at this point. But I think we have a lot more pressing issues, some of which we spoke about here tonight, that we need to be addressing. And I think, among others, is investment in our state, and investment in infrastructure, and investment in education. And, the economy is doing pretty well right now, but we have to continue to invest. Infrastructure is an important thing. We talked about the Scudder Falls Bridge. I voted for Act 89 several years ago. That's pumped $2.5 billion more into our transportation infrastructure. That's why a lot of these roads that you're seeing now are being repaved. It's why the Army train station was redone, and the train station in Levittown has been redone. But candidly, we have to keep investing. I mean, it's expensive. If we want to continue to attract business to Pennsylvania and get businesses to start up here and stay here, then we have to invest both in transportation infrastructure and human capital, which is people and education. And that means not just college, but for people who want to go into a vocation and be technically trained, to provide that option as well. And for workforce development and training throughout people's careers. Because here's the thing, we haven't really talked about this tonight, and we're getting toward the end here, but part of the change in our economy that's happened certainly has had to do with globalization, but an even bigger component is technological change. And I don't don't think as policymakers at the state or federal level, we are really thinking the next 20 and 30 years and how it's going to impact the job market and the economy. You think about artificial intelligence and a lot of the other technological changes that are happening that have the potential to put a lot of sectors of the economy in sectors where people need to do jobs now out of business. And I don't think we're really focusing on that, and we need to start focusing on that because it's really, it may not impact my generation quite as much. But I think, you know, a lot of these, the kids that are in that millennial generation, and a lot of it's going to have a huge impact on that. And we need to be thinking about what that impact is going to be and what we do in terms of training going forward, because it's going to be a major issue that has the potential to really devastate employment, not just in Pennsylvania, but throughout the United States. So those are the types of issues I would rather see a 67 county tour on than, with all due respect, than, you know, legalization of marijuana. I think there's just many more important things than that. So, thank you. Thank you all. I really appreciate everyone coming out here tonight and participating. Those who are watching on Facebook and had questions, thank you for participating as well. And I will continue to do this, you know, over the next 3 years of my term to get your feedback. And I want to say, even where we might disagree on issues, I'm always happy to listen, and I'm always happy to take other points of view into account. I hope I'm never at that point where I think I've cornered the market on wisdom and I've got it all figured out, because you know, when that day comes, just push me aside. We all have something to learn from one another, and we are at root a democracy, and this is the basic part of democracy. All of us have our voices heard. So I don't, you know, at the state legislative level, we don't always get that opportunity as much as we do at the local level, for example. So that's why these town halls are very important, and I'll be doing more of them down the road. So thank you all very much.